Thanks for joining us. We are so excited to be back with Don Winslow, even if virtually. In fact, Don, we have done this together for every book, haven't we, except the first one.
We have. We've done this 20 times at least.
But
So
but we progressed because the first time that Don and I did this, I bought the only book sold. Do you remember that?
I remember it vividly, and I also remember you gave us cookies, which we needed.
You know, that's been my standard ploy. Feed authors, they always come to the poison pen. In any case, Don, we have watched your sales and your work grow over all this time, and I'm so pleased. I have a personal collection, and I remember back, although I really loved your big cartel series and the Force and the surfing books and California Fire and Life and the Death and Life of Bobby Z. But I still remember the Trail to Buddha's Mirror, which inspired me to go to Hong Kong, and possibly my favorite book title ever, The Long Walk Up the Water Slide. You were a genius for really great titles.
You think? I don't know. They've gotten shorter over the years, haven't they? Maybe so have I, but a cool breeze on the underground, a long walk up the water slide, a lot of long titles.
They were, but they were wonderful. So, Patrick Millikin of our staff is going to be talking to Don, and you guys are free watching it to ask questions, which we'll try to answer. And finally, Don has signed several hundred books, and they are, I think, on their way to us, are they not?
They should be. I sent them out last week. I signed them literally overnight, the same night they came in, and got them out the next morning. So hopefully they'll be there really soon.
And we have a very cool insert, something written by Don especially for the Poison Pen. So I would suggest that you do not delay in ordering your signed copy of Broken. Now with that, Patrick.
Bye, Barbara. Good to see
Bye.
you.
All right. Don, always great to see you.
Great. Yeah.
And looking forward to talking about this new book, which is your first collection of short fiction to date.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about, kind of how it came about? And the title is sure, Broken is definitely a appropriate metaphor for our times right now, isn't it?
Yeah, we didn't know quite how appropriate it was going to be.
Yeah.
Certainly in the past few weeks, things feel pretty broken. Patrick, well, you and I have been around each other for 20 years now.
Yeah.
And so you know that for most of that 20, 22 years, I've been writing pretty long books.
Right.
Kind of epics, kind of a long distance runner. And during a lot of that time, though, I had some stories in mind that I knew weren't epic in scope. They were one location over the course of a few days or weeks rather than spanning continents and decades. I knew they were more substantive than short stories, but I knew they weren't epics. They were somewhere in that middle range that I guess we call the novella. And so I thought I'd give it a shot.
I know you mentioned somewhere that you were a big fan of Jim Harrison's novellas.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I mean, that's kind of his bread and butter was the novella, wasn't it? There aren't many writers like that.
Yeah, well, Stephen King, I was a big fan of his novellas. Harrison's Brown Dog, which was eventually volumed together. I think when I came to sort of the last 50 pages of Brown Dog, I slowed down reading because I just didn't want to leave that character ever. So it was a little scary territory to walk in, those guys' footsteps. At the same time, though, I had these stories that I really wanted to tell, and so I went ahead and started typing.
It's one thing I wanted to ask you. Reading these stories, and also reading, a lot of your recent work. I think of The Force in particular. There's an awful lot about sort of the psychology of, or the realities of being a police officer, in all kinds of different ways. Existentially. And especially with this really stunning title story. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, look, I think if you're around this life long enough, like a cop is, it breaks you at least a little bit. It has to, whether you're going to admit it or not. And I think the things that those people experience, that they go through, that they see, we don't realize the emotional consequences of that, the scar that it leaves. In this particular story, I wanted to take the force a little further along that theme, and I wanted to look at a guy who, from his family, was somewhat broken, from his dad, who was a cop, was somewhat broken, and who really learns the cost of some of this, but also the cost of revenge. You know, what's the moral price of revenge? What do we pay for that? Right. And is it worth it? And can we come back from it?
And it's funny, you know, rather than focusing on one single cop, I mean, this is an entire cop family. You know, the matriarch is the dispatcher.
Yeah.
I should say it's set in New Orleans. Was there a particular reason for that location?
Yeah, sure. You know, it's a sort of a third hometown for me. My mom's from New Orleans. My grandmother was from New Orleans. In fact, she was a ward healer for Huey Long back in the day and was a professional gambler in New Orleans. And so I was half raised in that town as a child. I almost slip into a New Orleans accent when I say that. So I've always wanted to set a story there, and that's the reason. You talk about the family of cops and Ava, the mother, being the matriarch. It was an interesting experience to write about a police dispatcher, because think about this. You're sitting removed from the action. You're hearing it and you're watching it as blips on a screen. You know what the problem is, what's going on. You're hearing it come across the radio calls. It has to be terrifying in a way, particularly when your own loved ones are the people who are out there.
That's what I was going to say. Your own sons are out there. And then the father, you know, the patriarch, as it were, you know, he's a kind of off screen for most of the book, but his presence is really palpable throughout.
Yeah, as fathers are. You know, I think you got these two adult sons who are literally following in their father's footsteps. In some ways, they want to be exactly like him, and in other ways, they want to be completely different from a guy who was, you know, alcoholic and abusive.
Right. Now let's just kind of go through the stories in the book real quick. I don't want to, you know, my tendency is to do spoilers, so I'm going to try not to do that this time.
Me too, yeah.
But you've got these three really interconnected, wonderful stories that are kind of shout outs to different heroes of yours. You got Crime 101, which is in some ways a tribute to Steve McQueen, and then you have this wonderfully funny, tragic, sad story called San Diego Zoo. I don't know how you managed to pull it off, which is a classic in many ways, Elmore Leonard's style piece, but kind of bent on its ear, I thought. Really terrific story. And then the third story, an homage to Raymond Chandler. I don't know if I have a question here, but can you talk about how those three characters kind of informed your work and approaching these three stories?
Yeah, you know, Crime 101 is about a diamond thief who models himself after Steve McQueen. There's a T-shirt running around right now that says, always be yourself, but if you can't be yourself, be Batman. I would amend that to read, be Steve McQueen. I mean, he was the embodiment, wasn't he? He was the personification of California cool, but also sort of American cool from that era. And I just had this weird idea. Could I combine my adoration of Steve McQueen with Highway 101 in California, cool cars going up and down that cool road? But I also like the pun. I like the idea of Crime 101, you know, set of rules. And could I put all those things together and see if it worked out? I'm not the one to judge if it did, but I hope it did. The second story, you know, is dedicated to Mr. Leonard, you know, who was a god. You know, I think some writers are admired, others are revered. All of us in this genre revered Mr. Leonard. I can't bring myself to call him Dutch. You know, I didn't know him. I wasn't an intimate of his. But when I was a PI thinking about doing this thing, you know, I was reading Elmore Leonard books and thinking, man, if I could tell a story, something like that, that would be a great life. you know. And so that starts off with a chimpanzee with a revolver and goes from there. Uh, the third story in that set, because they're all interrelated, the characters move in and out of those three novellas, I dedicated to Raymond Chandler, because without Chandler, none of us exist. You know, he invented this genre in so many ways. And also, I'm always very, very happy to tell my LA friends that Raymond Chandler wrote his great LA novels while he was living in San Diego. And a year or so ago, I got to go to the house. I was invited to the house. And I got to go to the room, Patrick Millikin.
This is in La Jolla?
It's in La Jolla,
yeah,
where Raymond Chandler wrote The Long Goodbye.
Yeah.
That was going to church. That was going to a cathedral. And I went into a room where a drunken Raymond Chandler had tried to shoot his wife, and the bullet holes are still in the walls. So, yeah, I just, you know, when you have a chance, it's nice to give a shout out to your heroes and people who've meant something to you in your life, even though you never met them.
Right. Now, I gotta say, there's a character. I'm going to get his name wrong, but you can correct me on it. Lieutenant Lubeznik, who,
Yeah.
for all you folks out there who are going to read this, I hope you're like me and you're going to say, all right, Don, it's time for a Lubeznik novel. Because this guy, what a wonderful character. He reminded me a lot of, I'm not sure if you've read Charles Willeford's Hoke Mosley books. He reminded me a little bit of Hoke Mosley. Just a terrific character and kind of... Can you talk a little bit about him and where he comes from?
The name comes from a guy I know in Solana Beach, and there's a coffee house that's featured in these stories, and that's a real place. And I used to sit there with the real Ron Lubeznik, who was not a cop, a very different kind of guy, a retired accountant, and a guy I'm very fond of. And so I named that character for him. I don't know where the character came from, Patrick, to tell you the truth. I just started typing, you know, and this guy just kind of came to life on me, and I used him in three of these novellas. I just liked the guy, but where he came from, I can't tell you. I don't know how some of these things happen, you know.
Now, I had asked you; these are all original pieces. They've never been published anywhere else, correct?
Oh, no, these are all original. Absolutely, yeah.
What are the challenges? You mentioned it. You mentioned it first. You know, in recent years, you've done these big operatic epics. You know, massive canvas. How do you compare it? Was going to the short work a challenge for you, or was it kind of let's cleanse the palate a little bit here and tell us a little bit about your approach and the challenges of each form?
You know, I used this analogy, I think, earlier in the interview that the epics are marathons, they're ultra marathons, and I loved them for that. You know, there came that moment in each of those books where you're totally exhausted as a writer, and then looked up, but you're only at mile 19. You know, to torture the metaphor, and somehow you had to find the way to get to the finish of it. These was almost the opposite problem. You know, I knew they weren't sprints, and yet when I first started writing them, I treated them too much like that. And I had to look at them again and say, no, hey, Don, you don't have to be in so much of a hurry. You know how a short story can turn on a syllable, literally, right? You can make or break a short story with a syllable, I'm convinced. But with a novella, there was a little bit more leisure. And I realized, you know, I can take a little diversion. I can do a little more character development. I can take time to be a little funny if I want, to tell a funny story. So I had to, it was in the editing, really, where I had to go back and say, whoa, wait a second. This is a 10K. There's time, you know, there's time to get to the finish line.
Right. It's funny because they really, you know, sometimes you'll read a novella and it will, I don't know, these actually do feel like short novels. Maybe it's a question of semantics, you know, novella versus short novel. Is it the same thing? But they average about 50 or 60 pages each, and yet they feel complete entity in and of themselves. It's pretty amazing.
Well, thank you, and thank you. I really appreciate that. That's what I was trying to do. I hope it worked, and we'll see.
Now, then we have a couple of other stories just to briefly touch on here. You bring back some of your beloved characters. One of them particularly set in Kauai. Can you talk a little bit about, is it Paradise, right?
Yeah, Paradise. Yeah, I bring back Ben, Sean, and O of Savages and the Kings of Cool, which is always tricky. Kings of Cool is a prequel to Savages because at the end of Savages, Oliver Stone notwithstanding, the three characters die. And so anytime I want to go back to Ben, Sean, and O, which I often do because I just like them a lot, I have to
go back.
think back. I have to go back.
Right.
And I do math, which annoys me. How old would they have been in a certain year, and what would they have been doing? And I wanted to go to Kauai because I love it. I haven't been all over the world, but I've been to a lot of it. And Hanalei and Kauai might be the prettiest place on earth, and my family and I go there a lot, on holiday. So it was funny though, Patrick, this is embarrassing, that I started writing that story to bring Ben, Sean, and O there. And then I remembered that at the end of a book called The Death and Life of Bobby Z, I had Bobby Z sailing toward Hawaii.
Now, wait a minute, Don. You don't want to give away too much here.
Yeah, I will not. And then there was another character that I had remembered that I had left there. I'm not going to name it at this point. Yeah. So then I went and I really did the math. And I thought, you know what? I can put all of these people together in this small place in a very narrow window of time and see what happens with them. The other thing is, that paradise is one synonym for heaven. And heaven is where we meet again people who passed.
That's true.
And we can spend time with them, and that's kind of one definition of paradise.
Now, the last story, very intense piece of writing, very personal piece of writing. I remember when you finished The Border, you famously said, "That's it. I'm never going to write about the border again." And I knew that you couldn't do that. Tell us a little bit about the story, The Last Ride.
When I wrote The Border, we weren't throwing kids into cages and picking them from their parents. And so, yeah, I thought I was done. In fact, I thought I was done with Broken. And then, given the news and everything else, realized that, yeah, I needed to write this other story about a Border Patrol agent, an old cowboy who now rides with the Border Patrol. And he sees a little girl in a cage who's been ripped from her mother. He's a Trump supporter. He's a conservative. He's a rancher who owns a ranch on the border. We meet him when he's repairing a fence that's been cut, and as I've had to do here, by the way. And he decides he's going to do something about it.
There you go. Well, I'm sure we have some questions from the audience. Let's see. We'll keep this kind of on the shortish side, but I wanted to ask you a few questions. I know you have various movie and TV projects going all the time. Is the FX thing still in the works now?
Yep. Very much in the works. The Force is very much in the works, so everything's kind of moving forward. Yeah.
Nothing.
Of course, right now, nothing's moving, in reality, because we're all, in our little caves.
Right. Kind of jokingly before we started this, I asked you about, this kind of strange era that we're in at the moment. Have you had any indication on how the cartels are kind of adapting to this new world? Are they taking advantage of it in some way? You brought up to me the rumor that they were getting into the hand cleanser, sanitizer business, which I have not heard that. It wouldn't shock me though, or they're lacing it with something. I doubt, however, that they're wiping down their bricks of heroin with wipes. So I'd be cautious about that. Yeah.
Anytime anything becomes precious and scarce, organized crime is going to find its way into that. It's the nature of the beast.
Right. Where do you see yourself going next? Have you already started a new project?
Oh yeah, yeah.
I know your work ethic.
Yeah, I don't know if it's work ethic or addiction or what it is, or it's just that, an old stable horse is just used to riding. I don't know. But yeah, I'm working on several things at once. I'm not really ready to come out and say what they are. I'm very excited about them. But yeah, Patrick, I'm a little, I don't know if it's superstitious or what it is, but I kind of feel that if I talk about a book that's not written, I somehow kill it. I have this feeling that you can either talk about writing or you can write, but it's very, very difficult to do both. And so I tend to keep the projects I'm working on pretty close to the chest. I don't even talk about them at home. My wife will sometimes say, what are you doing? And I'll give kind of a general sort of answer to that.
Right.
So that's sort of sort of general. Yeah, I'm working, and yeah, just the usual drill, up in the morning and do it and go home.
Is there a possibility, you've been hearing this for 20-some years, that a certain Neil Carey is going to come back at any given time?
Well, I think, Patrick, thanks for that question. It's more than a possibility. It's a certainty. And if you pick up Broken, that might happen to you.
How about, will he have his own novel again at some point in the future?
One thing I've learned about this thing of ours, never say never.
Yeah.
Because I've so many times. I have no immediate plans to do a full Neil Carey novel. But again, I've denied that I was going to do so many things. Sincerely, I wasn't lying. I was just deluded. So we'll see.
Well, let's see. I think we may have a couple of questions here from our viewing audience.
So one of them is, have you read Kevin Barry's There Are Little Kingdoms?
Did you hear that question? Have you read Kevin Barry's Little Kingdoms?
I'm sorry to say that I haven't. The sad thing about doing what I do, and particularly in writing these big, long, fat books, is that 95% of my reading time is spent with research reading, and I have very little time to read for pleasure. It almost, in fact, never happens, which is a sad thing.
Yeah. It's funny. I remember when I first met you, you were busily making your way through a great books kind of program. I remember you were reading all these classics, the Greeks, and
yeah, I did it too. I found one of those because listen, I'm undereducated. I have a master's degree in military history, a bachelor's degree in African history. So my education's extremely narrow, my formal education. So yeah, a number of years ago when you and I first met, I think, I found one of those lists, of the great books. I read every one of them.
And I know from talking to you before that, Shakespeare is huge in your life and in your work. You keep going back to Shakespeare?
I do. That is some of my leisure reading. Sometimes I'll just, if I have an hour or so, Sundays I usually devote just to reading. And sometimes I'll just sit down with the collected works of Shakespeare, open it at random, and read. During these quarantine times, if you're looking for something sort of dweebish but really interesting to do, read the collected works of Shakespeare, the plays, in the order in which he wrote them, chronologically. It's an absolute revelation. You will see characters develop along the course of time in an amazing kind of way.
Wow.
What other books or movies or TV shows would you recommend to your audience during this quarantine time? Kind of a segue.
Man, there are so many. What have I been watching? I just rewatched Michael Mann's wonderful, certainly one of the best crime films ever made, Thief, with James Caan and Tuesday Weld and an outstanding supporting cast. I'll tell you what, there's a scene between James Caan and Tuesday Weld in a diner that is one of the most romantic scenes ever in film, and that's in Thief. I just loved it. I also rewatched Heat, which is a great film. I watched Nicholas Ray's first film, with the name of which just went straight out of my head, but it will come to me. Been rewatching Mad Men.
Great series.
I'm excited that season 3 of Babylon Berlin is back on, which is a terrific German series about a detective in the Weimar Republic. The Dublin Murders, I liked a lot. Yeah.
Was it hard to revisit characters you had already written about? Were some of the storylines based on ones you had to previously cut out?
Let me answer the second half of that question first. No, I didn't pick up on any previous storylines. These are all very, very fresh. They're really organic because it was so much fun to revisit these characters. You know, people had been asking me, as Patrick alluded to, about Neil for years and about Boone Daniels, who comes back in these stories for years. So it was fun to see them in a new way, in a different way, to ask myself the question, whatever happened to Neil? You know, I left him in the desert a long time ago. And did he ever realize his ambition to become a professor of literature or not? It was fun to pick up Boone in a different way. Maybe a slightly more mature Boone, maybe slightly sadder in some ways, Boone Daniels, and looking at life in a different kind of way. The story Sunset, in a lot of ways, is a story about loss, a story about loss of a vocation in one case, loss of a spouse, loss of a hero figure. You know, sunsets are about things ending. So it was interesting to pick Boone up in that sense, although I'm not convinced that I'm finished with him yet either.
You said you're working on a few different things at once. Do you carry each one to completion simultaneously, or does one project become a front runner and take all of your attention? And is that how you typically work?
If that's how it typically works, boy, we're talking a lot about horses in this interview, but I like to have more than one pony in the corral, you know, because when one gets tired, I hop on the other. Typically, you know, I start work around 5:30 in the morning, and I know that by 2 in the afternoon that most of the stuff I'm going to do on that project's going to suck. And so, but I'm not ready to finish work for the day. You know, I'm not ready to fold it up. So what I will typically do is I'll look at one of those other projects and work on it for a couple of hours. And then at some point, one of those projects becomes almost literally the front runner. And then I'll stay with that to completion and then go back to the others.
For the Cartel trilogy, I was curious about this too. How did you research such a sensitive subject, such as the cartel war in Latin America, Mexico? And are there any precautions on taking that story to the screen on a more truthful way than others before?
Good question.
Yeah, again, there are 2 questions there. Let me do my best. Sure, the research was tricky, but, you know, I was on that beat for 22 or 23 years. And so the research changed over time. The situations changed over time. When I first started, people were trying to hide the things that they did. By the time I came to write The Cartel, they were proclaiming those atrocities on the internet. By the time I came to The Border, sadly, a number of my sources were dead, had either been murdered or had died of overdoses. I knew the beat really well by that time. I knew the information, so it was more a matter of just kind of keeping up with current developments. In terms of creating it now for television, it's very important to us that we portray a fuller picture of Mexican and Central American culture. That while, of course, the spine of the story is about Art Keller and the war on drugs and all of that, that we're also showing Mexican journalists, Mexican artists, social activists, doctors, farmers of legitimate produce, a number of other people, and that we show that culture in its fullest flower, that it's not just confined to the narco world and to narcos, but that we talk about families and writing and poetry and dance and food and clothes, to give a more sort of complete picture. That's really important to us.
How would you compare Steve McQueen with Jack Reacher?
Wow. He's a lot shorter. It's funny. I'm talking with Lee tomorrow night. I might ask him that question because, McQueen back in the day might have made a really good Jack Reacher. Listen, they're both very cool, aren't they? And almost every McQueen character had a code, in the way that Reacher has a code, in the way that Raymond Chandler sort of handed us that code. This is paraphrasing, but I've got it pretty correct. Down these mean streets must walk a man who is not himself mean. That was the cowboy code before it was Raymond Chandler's code. It was the cowboy code I was trying to get to in this last story, The Last Ride. It's a real interesting off-the-wall question. Thank you for it. I'll have to give it more thought, but McQueen might have made a good Jack Reacher.
I always thought kind of Lee Marvin in his prime would be a good Reacher, physically too.
Robert Mitchum.
Mitchum, yeah.
Mitchum.
I still think, just because you're a Chandler fan, I've always thought that the 1974 Farewell My Lovely film version with
which I watched,
which Mitchum as Chandler is the finest adaptation, at least in my opinion. I thought Mitchum.
Yeah. I'm going to argue with you about that, Patrick. Okay. I love The Long Goodbye with Elliot Gould, believe it or not, and Sterling Hayden. Yeah, I'm the guy who loved that film a lot. Do you know a weird thing about that adaptation you're just talking about? Do you know who's in that film?
Jim Thompson.
Jim Thompson.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. And I was watching it, and usually when I'm watching sort of older films, I have IMDb on another screen simultaneously, so I can keep track of that. And I see Jim Thompson. I went, no, it can't be. And it was.
It's crazy. Yeah. And Charlotte Rampling, who's just...
Charlotte Rampling, playing Lauren Bacall.
Right.
Basically, yeah. And, of course, Nina Van Pallant played the role of the cool blonde in my version of The Long Goodbye that I loved, the Altman version.
Love Sterling Hayden, too. He was the ultimate film noir, badass, intellectual, renegade.
What a great actor. I've been watching The Asphalt Jungle the last couple of days. Another film I've been watching while we're all, put down here in arcades. Yeah. Great Sterling Hayden.
Have you read his memoir? I know we digress a little bit, but what the hell? Have you read his memoir, The Wanderer?
I just ordered it.
Oh, it's fantastic. You're going to love it. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah.
And our friend Tom, of course, who wrote a song, Sterling.
This one's actually for both of you guys. This gentleman would like to know your favorite Steve McQueen movie, favorite Elmore Leonard book, and favorite Chandler novel from each of you.
You first, Patrick. I think I've given my answers away already, but go ahead.
Well, Chandler would have to be The Long Goodbye, but I love them all. But The Long Goodbye, I think he just threw everything but the kitchen sink in there, and he captures California, and specifically in all of its weirdness so well. Steve McQueen, I don't know. I guess I would have to say Bullet. I saw it again recently, and you see Jacqueline Bisset perfectly right at that moment in time. I know it's a wonderful movie.
Look at that. I love your face, Millikin.
Sorry. And as far as Elmore Leonard, oh my gosh, that's a toughie.
Tough.
I'll have to think about that one. I love, I like the Westerns. I love Valdez, as he pronounces it, is coming. But City Primeval, that whole era, Swag, probably the late 70s maybe.
These are tough questions. There are no bad choices. I'm going to go with The Long Goodbye as the novel as well. The best Chandler novel, probably the best PI novel ever written by anybody. For the Steve McQueen movie, tough. I'm going to go with The Getaway. For the Elmore Leonard novel, all right, Unknown Man 89.
Yeah.
What is your favorite place to visit in New Orleans? Any favorite restaurants?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, when I was a kid, without doubt, the Morning Call, there on the river, to go after a night of partying and to have the beignets and the cafe au lait. Man, there was nothing like it. The Court of the Two Sisters. God, there's so much good stuff there. But the Morning Call.
What is the best Springsteen song to get you through these times?
Yeah.
Is this to both of us? I'd love to hear Patrick's answer.
I think it. Well, I'm going to make it to both of you. So
I would switch gears and go to Tom Russell. You mentioned him earlier. Gosh, I don't know. I'm going to have to pass.
Yeah. He wrote a song, and he's unaware that it's about noir fiction, called Darkness on the Edge of Town, which is sort of an anthem of mine as a writer. Tonight I'll be on that hill with everything I've got. I'll be there on time, and I'll pay the cost for wanting things that can only be found in the darkness on the edge of town.
were you upset about The Irishman being made into a film instead of Frankie Machine? Will Frankie Machine ever be turned into a film?
These are great questions.
These are great.
They are great questions. I hate this one, but it's a great question. Upset would not be the word. Look, it's funny. I was just writing about this. Yeah, I mean, I was disappointed for sure. You know, and everyone knows the story now because they all talked about it on Netflix. About, you know, someone sending De Niro a book called You Paint Houses, Don't You, as research for playing Frankie Machine, and then De Niro and Scorsese liked that book better and made it instead of Frankie Machine. Well, yeah, I wasn't happy about it, but look, these things happen. You know, I love De Niro, I love Scorsese. They are cultural icons for every good reason. God bless. Having said that, I have not seen The Irishman yet. I will bring myself to see it. I haven't quite been able to do it. In terms of Frankie becoming a film, all I want to say at the moment is stay tuned.
In a segue, are there any new crime syndicates that you're currently researching for new stories? I hope they're not watching.
No.
Will the pandemic ever factor into one of your storylines?
I hope not. Listen, I kind of do one thing sort of well. I write crime stories. I'm not a scientist. I'm kind of too stupid to understand it. You know, we need Michael Crichton back for this, or, you know, or Steven or somebody to do that. I'm not the guy to do this. So I would doubt it. Having said that, again, though, never say never.
Any updates that you can give us on the Force movie adaptation? What was your reaction to hearing Matt Damon was cast?
Oh, ecstatic. You know, Damon's a great actor, and I haven't met him, by the way. Of everything I hear, a great guy, so I was ecstatic about it. I just say stay tuned. You know, things are moving ahead.
Do you see any of the new or old characters getting their own book down the road?
This is me thinking that you see on the screen. Not at the moment. Not at the moment. I'm sort of involved with newer things and newer characters. But again, you never know what happens on a Thursday afternoon. You know what I mean? Thursday afternoon around 3 o'clock. You know, sometimes you just start typing stuff. And sometimes it's old friends. That's what happened, you know, in the case of a couple of these stories in Broken. You know, I was just writing away and I thought, maybe I'll bring so-and-so in and see what happens. It's a 8 o'clock Thursday decision.
Right. Since we're just having a little fun here, I brought this old one, Isle of Joy, which is one of my favorite of your books. And it seems like it never gets enough attention that it deserves. Can you talk a little bit about this book, and maybe some of your fans don't know about it? It was originally written, at least in the States, it was published under a pseudonym that I can't remember. McDonald.
I can help you out here. MacDonald Lloyd.
Yeah.
It's called A Winter Spy. Because they refused, the publisher I was with for about 28 seconds, refused to call it Isle of Joy. And I said, you don't call it Isle of Joy, it ain't going to be written by Don Winslow. And they came up with A Winter Spy, I guess because the main character is a former spy and it all takes place in December. So I guess it makes a certain kind of sense. Listen, it's one of my favorite books too, Patrick. The entire book takes place in the last week of 1958, and it's about a spy named Walter Withers, who's now working corporate security as a private investigator, and he gets a case, and it's all set in the sort of jazz and nightclub demi-monde of New York City. I always thought that period of time was the absolute height of that culture. I was too young to have been there, and so the next best thing you can do is write about it. It was really fun to write a book that takes place in 7 days because of the research. You could know what the weather was every hour of that week. Restaurants sent me their menus from those exact dates. The people were so kind to me to send me photos of what nightclubs looked like. I worked with a great jazz historian who took me through all of that music for hour after hour. So I'm very fond of that book, and so thanks for plugging it a little bit.
You bet. We have another.
Do your books start with pen and paper, or do you strictly use the computer? Can you talk about your writing process?
Typically they start with neither. Typically they start with me just wandering around thinking about it until the characters start to talk to me. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm not here to lie to you. That's the truth. Then I will start with computer, except if I feel I need to slow myself down, if I feel I'm being too manic, too fast, then I go back to a yellow manuscript pad and a roller pen, and I write by hand, deliberately to slow my tempo down. And then, of course, I'll transcribe it later.
Which book between The Power of the Dog, The Cartel, and The Border is your favorite? Is there one you are most proud of? Which was the hardest to write?
Wow. These are great questions. Again, I'm not sure I like them, but they're great questions. I can't pick a favorite of those three. I really can't. I'm proud of Power of the Dog because it took me 6.5 years to research and write. So there was a struggle there, and I think struggle makes you fond something.
Now, wasn't the manuscript famously about twice as big as what we actually saw?
The original manuscript was 2,006 pages long, and the editorial note was one of the shortest in history, cut it in half, which was, I was so lost, I was so in the weeds on that. It was so painful to try to find the book in that hot mess, and I couldn't do it until I finally figured out that each character's question was, how do you live decently in an indecent world? And once I figured that out, then I could figure out how to do that book. Cartel's very dear to me, again, because of the struggle. It was so tough to write, not because of the length, but because of the subject matter, because that era was so especially brutal.
It's the Ciudad Juarez and all the heroic journalists that were...
Yes, all of that, and to be watching that on a daily basis for 3 years and writing about it was tough. Again, as Patrick mentioned, I swore I would never do it again. I came back and wrote The Border because I felt I had to, because I felt that the story wasn't finished. I thought it was, rather stupidly thought it was finished, and it wasn't. So I can't pick one of the three, as my favorite. I only have one kid, but I imagine that would be like looking at 3 kids of yours and saying, well, he's my favorite, even if you thought it never say it.
Well, you know, I remember that wonderful line in "The Cartel Is Us." You know, things have developed since the border.
Yeah.
Should we not go into that kind of territory?
Or whatever you want.
Any thoughts on that? Kind of where the story has gone since the events in that book?
Well, it's only gotten worse, hasn't it? You have a corrupt administration with a narcissist at its head, tilting toward fascism. That we've now had this narcissistic response to a national, international crisis that has wasted valuable time and has cost lives. That's my answer, Patrick.
Yep. Fair enough. Yeah.
We could always lighten it up by asking your top 3 literary PIs.
Top 3 literary PIs.
Whoa. Philip Marlowe, Lou Archer, maybe Hope Mosley.
Can't argue with that. Yeah.
This is a good one. What music do you listen to when you're writing?
It depends on what I'm writing. It's a great question. I will change it up depending on the book. So when I was doing the cartel books, when I'm writing the Mexican scenes, I listen to Mexican music. I listen to a lot of, narco music produced by the bands that the cartels sponsored. When I was doing the Force, I'm a jazz guy. Given my own want, I listen to a lot of jazz, or I listen to a lot of Springsteen, but I knew that neither of them would work for the Force. I needed a different musical soundtrack, so I listened almost exclusively to hip hop, and I would crank it up to like mad volume and just pound at that keyboard. But it was very useful to do. It was instructive, and I liked it quite a bit. I was surprised at how much I liked it. When I was writing, for instance, the Last Ride, the final novella of this book, I was listening to country western. I was listening to our buddy Tom Russell. I was listening to Willie. I was listening to Larry McMurtry's son, James McMurtry, great country western singer-songwriter. I was listening to Merle Haggard, Emmylou Harris. So it really depends. When I was writing one of the stories in this book, Sunset, one of the protagonists is a fan of West Coast jazz, a very particular subgenre of jazz. And so, of course, I had that on the whole time. So I pick it very particularly to what I'm writing to set a mood for myself.
So it's Jerry Mulligan and all those guys?
Yeah. Jerry Mulligan would deny that he was a West Coast jazz guy. He really ran away from that label because he spent very little time on the West Coast. But Curtis Counts, Harold Land, Art Pepper had a swing out there. Lee Morgan recorded a trumpet player who was murdered by his wife in Slug's Cafe in New York City during a gig.
Did you see the documentary about him?
Yeah, of course. I called it Morgan, yeah. So he did a very famous stint at the Lighthouse, which is a famous old joint out here on the West Coast. Eddie Safransky, I'm boring you to tears. There are a lot of really good people.
Are you a collector of anything? Do you have a piece or item that you are most proud of?
I have a Neolithic arrowhead from a Buffalo Kill site in Montana that I like. I have a collection of African spears. Little known but true fact, I spent years as an African safari guide on photographic safaris. When our son Thomas was born, spears and shields arrived from Maasai and Samburu warriors for my kid. That's about it. I'm not a big collector. Oddly enough, I'm not a book collector. For one thing, I could never afford it until relatively recently. The books I do collect are almost exclusively paperbacks. I do love paperback noir. Yeah.
I'm going to read this one verbatim.
Let's just do one more question and then we'll take it in for landing here.
So this is verbatim. Okay, what are your top 3 movie PIs and why aren't they all Jeff the Dude Lebowski?
Is that Shane?
It could be. Why aren't they Jeff the Dude? Well, I love Jeff the Dude. My wife has a crush on Jeff Bridges. I took her to see him performing live at the Belly Up here in San Diego with his band. Okay. Boy, again, these are tough questions. I'm going to go with, and this is going to infuriate people, Elliot Gould and The Long Goodbye. Other than that, in terms of film, I guess Robert Mitchum and Farewell My Lover. Although I didn't love the film so much. Number 3, maybe Alec Baldwin in Miami Heat. Oh gosh, no! What the hell am I thinking about? Jack Nicholson, Jake Geddes in Chinatown. For God's sake, I'm a little tired. Of course, that's right there. Has to be.
That's awesome. Well, hey Don, thank you so much for spending some time. And sorry we got off track a bit, but it's been
had a great time.
A lot of fun talking with you as always, and look forward to seeing you again soon when all this kind of craziness goes away. Let's hope it does.
Yep. Yeah. And thank everyone who tuned in. I guess that's the correct expression.
Yeah.
And just to everyone, please be safe and be well, huh? And I look forward to the time because, the bookstores mean so much to me. You guys have been such supporters of mine, before, when you were selling one book. And I appreciate you. And without the readers, I don't have this work that I love. So God bless you all. Please stay safe.
All right. We love you, Don. Look forward to seeing you soon. All right.
Bye-bye.